Hello everyone, welcome to MD Media's weekly show, The Panel. This panel will talk about October 24 peace talks and beyond, what to expect and do. In relation to that, today the UN Security Council had a private meeting, but the UN ambassador of the US made a stick out explanation after the meeting. Here is what will set our agenda today, among other things.
Just a quick brief statement. The Security Council just met to discuss the conflict in Ethiopia in a closed meeting. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the A3 and the African Union for leading on this process, including the statement that was issued by the African Union today. And we were briefed by the African Union. It's disappointing that the Council did not agree on issuing a statement, which is why it's important for me to come out here today. As the Secretary General said this week, and I quote, "The situation in Ethiopia is spiraling out of control. The social fabric is being ripped apart, and civilians are paying a horrific price. In the past week alone, we've seen a serious uptick in fighting and violence. Thousands of Ethiopian, Eritrean, TPLF forces are engaged in active combat. The scale of the fighting and deaths rival what we're seeing in Ukraine, and innocent civilians are being caught in the crossfire. Over 2 years of conflict, as many as half a million people have died. And the United States is deeply concerned about the potential for further mass atrocities. And we all should be. We're also horrified by the recent death of an aid worker from the International Rescue Committee and the injuries of others. We heard today that a total of 26 humanitarian workers have been killed over the course of the past 2 years. That's approximately 2 per month. This tragedy underscores the serious dangers facing humanitarian workers in the region. And as I told the Security Council just now, it's past time for all of the parties to lay down their weapons and return to peace. It is past time for a cessation of hostilities and for unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need. And it is past time for your Eritrean defense forces to halt their joint military offensive and for Ethiopia to ask Eritrea to withdraw its soldiers from northern Ethiopia. We're pleased that the AU announced that peace talks will begin on Monday in South Africa, and we welcome the strong statement made by the African Union the AU Peace and Security Commission today. And we welcome the stated commitment by the governments of Ethiopia and Tigray regional authorities to participate in these meetings. It is critical that all of the parties seize this opportunity and engage seriously in talks to bring an end to the fighting and the suffering of the Ethiopian people. Once the fighting stops, and it must, warring parties must negotiate concrete modalities to prevent a return to conflict, including security arrangements, a pathway to broader political dialogue, and assurances of unhindered humanitarian access and restoration of services. I can tell you that the United States is fully and actively engaged in diplomatic efforts at the highest levels of our government to support the African Union. The United States remains prepared to take appropriate measures against those who obstruct a resolution of this conflict, and we're determined to have those who commit human rights abuses held to account. Let me be clear, there is no military solution to this conflict. The only path forward is for the parties to pursue a negotiated settlement through peace talks, and we must prevent the region from spiraling further out of control. There's no time to waste. Thank you very much.
Again, welcome everyone to our show H panel. Today we'll be talking about October 24 Peace Talks. That's on Monday and beyond, what to expect and do. Panelists Faisal Roble, Duke Burbridge, and Patrick White are here today. And Patrick, welcome back to the UMD Media, to the show. He is the lecturer at McGill University. He's also the executive producer, executive editor of Ethiopia Inside. So we start with the usual segment. The first segment is what stood out for each and everyone in the panel. Faisal, what stood out for you over the past 7 days?
Well, I think many things. Thank you very much, Getachew, and I welcome Patrick for the second time, I think, and Duke as a regular. I think the resumption of the war and the intensity of the conflict and how the US and the West, EU, have been unmoved by the largest conflict in the world is really is something that historians would be talking about, probably not today, but many, many years. And when you layer that with this conflict taking place in Africa, in one of Africa's oldest, if you will, empire state, a country that is very well known in the West, one wonders what would happen if this conflict was in Benin, or say a small, country that the West doesn't know. America and the West population probably know very well Ethiopia more than any other African country. Probably it matches that of South Africa. And for the West to be moving with the snail pace to even address some of the critical issues is really a telling to me. What's true for me is, probably we'll talk about that later on. Finally, I would say finally, the US is waking and smelling the coffee, as signified by two things. Linda's speech, which you have shown us, which says that must stop, the war must stop. I think that's a key word. And then speak of or expect from the 24th meeting in South Africa, some sort of modality for negotiation and peace talking to come out, which kind of tells me that there is an expectation on her part that at least hostility cessation would be the one result that the US is expecting from. And I think that plus today what came out from the Homeland Security to guarantee Ethiopians the protective status so that they can stay here legally until the Ethiopian conflict is resolved, is finally the US aligning its diplomacy with human rights issue at a minimum level at this point in time. At a minimum level are the two things that is true for me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Faisal. We'll come back to that. Duke, what about you? What stood out for you? You are muted, I guess. I heard there was an echo, so I muted everyone. So go ahead now.
Okay. To me, it was probably the ongoing offensive by the Ethiopian Eritrean forces into the northwest zone of Tigray as well as the central zone. It looks like now the consequences of this are immense on the humanitarian conditions. They've already displaced, it looks like, around 600,000 people is what the last estimate was. And these are populations, these are families and individuals that did not have the capacity to relocate again. This is a very dire situation that's in the making right now. And if there's no action, immediate action, then we could be looking at a significant loss of life from that.
Okay. Thank you, Duke. Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the recent announcement for peace talks, in one sense, you could say that's encouraging, but in another sense, what you've seen is that the Ethiopian government says one thing to the international community, And then in Amharic to their constituencies in Ethiopia, they say another thing. So to the international community, they say that they're open for peace talks without any preconditions, whereas to their constituency, they're saying that they're going to finish the TPLF, and we know that their goal is to recapture the region. And then that's not even taking into account Isaias Afwerki, who doesn't say anything to the media, but we know that his ultimate goal is even more diabolical in terms of his plans for Tigray. And then there's still the issue of Western Tigray and the Amhara forces and where they stand, and also the siege on Tigray that's still ongoing, and that the government forces seem to think is something that should be negotiated away. So despite the fact that some people might think that the idea that we're having peace talks is a step in the right direction, viewed more cynically, we could say that this is Abiy talking out both sides of his mouth and trying to get the donor money flowing, to get the World Bank money flowing, while still pursuing his ultimate objectives, which is to remove the Tigrayan regional government and to destroy the Tigrayan forces. But ultimately, I think even if they are successful, so we saw that they captured Shire. And so obviously, we've also heard just incredible figures about the loss of life in this recent round of conflict. But even if they do succeed, I think we can doubt whether the war will end then, or whether it'll just transition into a more long-scale, prolonged sort of insurgent guerrilla war that will just stretch on and on and on. So I don't know. I don't have a lot of cause for hope, sadly, at the moment, but still holding out hope to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Talking about what you mentioned, Patrick, on speaking in Amharic, something else, and giving the notion of interested in peace talks. This is what was distributed in Addis Ababa. So in Amharic, the government sub-city administration giving residents that they should take part in tomorrow's protest rally, and it's targeting the West. And they are warning if those who choose not to participate in that rally against the West, they would be deprived their right to receive any public service. And the government is blaming the West for trying to salvage the terrorists, they call them, the Tigray government defense forces. And they are saying this is happening at the time Ethiopia is gaining victory in this law enforcement campaign. So there are a number of indications that the government is saying something else in Amharic and different in English. With that, though, on Monday, the peace talks by the African Union in South Africa, both Tigray and Ethiopia expressed they would be taking part there. So this is from Redwan Hussein, who is the National Security Advisor of the Prime Minister, and then the Tigray government as well, through its spokesperson, expressed that they confirmed that they will take part. So that brings us to the topic of the day. What do you see? I mean, Patrick, you mentioned that already. So Faisal, how do you read what might or might not happen on Monday in South Africa?
I think Patrick's skepticism is well placed in terms of what can come out. This is probably the 6th time they are secretly or non-secretly meeting and nothing came out. And we have known through the process that Tigray local government has always been ready to negotiate this, whereas Ethiopian leaders tell one thing to the public and something else to the international world, including the ones that are organizing the meeting, i.e. African Union. I think I don't know if it's an ignorance kind of thing from Abiy and his team, or they think they are so clever that nobody realizes. They don't know that the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa gets every little literature and speech carried by any of Abiy's, employees, and gets translated for the State Department and for the national security just to monitor the war, because U.S. as a major international power has to monitor both the language as well as the activity. So I don't know what they are thinking. Even today, Ridwan Hussein was writing something that was completely contrary to the spirit of the talks. Why is the West and the United States of America still doesn't see, although they have all the information? It is really mind-boggling. Maybe the US is so desperate to really arrest this issue, they are willing to go an extra mile. I just checked the history of the veto used by US versus Russia, Soviet Union in the past. And Russia used close to 90 vetoes between 1955 and 1970s, mainly to support African liberation movements. That's when Russia was on the right side of any cause, whereas the US used most of its vetoes in the 70s to the 90s, probably to protect some issues pertaining to Israel. What comes out of that, and this would be a very interesting African studies, is that Russia today is using and has been using in the last few years its veto to really hinder African democratization and for Africa to move forward. A lot of people may not know this. A lot of Ethiopian intellectuals, just because of their chauvinistic, nationalistic attitude, may ignore this. But what has been happening with Russia's current situation, and then it flips. So Russia is using more and more veto to protect Syria and Ethiopia. So I think I've been thinking as to what is left for the United States and EU to really encourage the two parties to completely come into a peace negotiation, serious peace negotiation, particularly Ethiopia. I think Ethiopia has not used its carrot so far. I don't know for what reason. Maybe it doesn't want to lose Ethiopia. Maybe it's still married to that concept of anchor country, where Ethiopia is the anchor of the Horn of Africa. It is not working. So that's why I chose Linda's decisive words in her speech, that there must be an effort to stop the war, and something must come out from this round. If this doesn't work, and I share with Patrick, if I just go by the history, I don't expect a lot. By the history of AU's floppy and sloppy work, AU's insincere position about this conflict, Abiy's cleverness and shrewdness to think that he can cheat the entire and trick the entire world. If I put all those things together, I don't expect a lot. I may expect a bit of a hope because of Uhuru's role, that he may be somebody who is familiar with the nuances and may behave as a presidential in the discussion. Outside that, I think people should be prepared for a disappointment. And I tweeted that this morning. If positive things come out, we will welcome it. But I'm really braced for the negative outcome from this, and I'm hoping that I'm proven to be wrong.
Thank you, Faisal. And 3 days before this scheduled negotiation, today, the Tigray television, state television, announced that 9,400, more than 9,400 POWs, including 500 women, that is both Ethiopian and Eritrean POWs, were released today. So this is a very short clip from Tigray television.
የትግራይ መንግስት እዚህ ያለው ምርኮኛ ሁሉም ማለት ይቻላል ከዛሬ ማታ ጀምሮ በምህረት እንዲለቀቅ ወስነዋል። ለዚህ ምርኮኛ በሙሉ ምህረት እንዲለቀቁ ስለወሰነ እንኳን ደስ አላችሁ ማለት እንፈልጋለን።
what's your take on the scheduled peace talks? And Faisal was Patrick as well. They mentioned about this might not go anywhere if there is no pressure from those who can do that pressure. So, what's your reading?
Yeah, I mean the peace talks, when they happen, when they can get everybody to show up for them, it seems to be, so far, it's just been the Ethiopian representatives showing up with a message that they can't negotiate from, they can't move from, and it's been usually some, sort of very overly optimistic, some would say delusional message of, hey, this is all over, let's have a ceremony, let's have a surrender, or because they've been fed so many delusional thinking that everything's going the federal government's way, everything's happening, and these guys are ready to surrender. So if they are showing up again for a surrender ceremony, even with the progress that's been made on the ground by the federal troops, I don't think they're going to get it. It's going to be another just nothing, what do they call it, a nothing burger negotiation. But if they were waiting for one moment where they had some sort of upper hand, because they've been dying for some sort of victory, even on a small scale, the federal government has. If this is what they needed to come and negotiate in somewhat good faith, that would be wonderful. It's not what I think is happening, but there's always the chance that that's what's going to happen. But like Patrick and Faisal, I don't have very optimistic hopes for this negotiation.
Thank you, Doc. Patrick, I mean, the number of statements issued from different governments, including today, even from the Secretary of State. I'm just trying to show that here. He issued a statement a few hours ago. Yeah, this one, and from the European Union, from the UN, very strong statements that was cited by the US ambassador to the UN as well early on, what the UN Secretary General said this week and so on. So does that show any pressure that meaningful progress might be on the table? And the other aspect is that there were people who were saying the issue Abiy was mentioning was without upper hand or without showing that he has something to show in Tigray, that would be difficult for him to negotiate and so on. So with his forces in Shire, does that give him any incentive in terms of at least arguing for any cessation of hostilities, Patrick?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do feel that the statements have gotten stronger from the international community, the United States included. And in one sense, you could say that's encouraging. In another sense, you have to ask what is behind those statements. Are there going to be any actual actions? And even if there are, will they be able to influence Abiy, Isaias, and others? And also, from another perspective, I think they're worried because we know what happened the first time those forces took over Tigray. We saw the carnage that was inflicted on Tigray. And so I think there is a real genuine fear of another round of genocidal violence being inflicted on Tigray. And so I do think that's what's behind the statements. But I wonder which actions would be taken, when, and whether those actions would actually have an influence. When it comes to Abiy, you've had this campaign of hashtag disarm TPLF or hashtag disarm TDF. It just seems like that's completely an unrealistic goal. So if that's the type of mentality they're bringing to the negotiating table, then you say, well, what is the point of the negotiations, right? If the starting point for the government of the negotiations is that the Tigrayan forces need to disarm, then of course that's never going to be agreed to. So you'd say, what is the point of negotiations? So, I mean, on the side of the Tigrayan forces, they had a number of preconditions or demands, but a lot of them were essentially turning on basic services and things like allowing humanitarian aid that never should have been blocked in the first place. I think like certain other matters, as much as like Western Tigray was taken unconstitutionally and by force and ethnically cleansed, the reality of the situation at this day and time is that maybe that is something that needs to be not made a first order issue. I saw the International Crisis Group's statement was saying that if we're going to say basic services are part of the negotiations, then we should say that that's the only thing we're going to discuss first order of business. We're not talking about anything else. We're talking about restoring services and aid, and then we can move on, right? But so I guess it really matters in terms of where the government's coming from. If they really think that the only way to negotiate is by the Tigrayan forces agreeing to disarm, then it's going to be a non-starter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think talking about settlements, today this was also from the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. And this is maybe their fifth or sixth statement. The first one in November 2020, then the rest in 2021. So this is the first for 2022. One thing that people are talking is the last time this was tried, October 8th, there was, I think, the African Union announced it, and Tigray accepted immediately. And then Uhuru Kenyatta, who is supposed to be in the mediation panel, he said, at least his statement was showing that he read it just as everybody else, as a communique. So, but this time there is a report that he confirmed he would be taking part in this. And we have still Obasanjo in the team, and former Vice President of South Africa as well in the team. With the two confirmed, is there anything that we might, I mean, the African Union must have learned? I mean, can we say that it has learned the way it did October 8th, and this one is more serious? What is your reading in terms of what was mentioned as problem in logistics and in consulting the parties, including the mediators? Faisal.
Yeah, at the expense of, at the risk of being wrong, I think if nothing comes out from this round of negotiation, the West, particularly the US, will be part of the problem, not part of the solution. And people will understand it that way. Now, there is a little bit of a hope that something may work this time. And I'm just doing this as an analytical aspect of the situation. The fact that Ethiopian defense forces with Eritrean forces have captured population centers such as Shire and Alameda, that may give them a cover for their rhetoric and blind supporters to say that we are there and negotiating to distribute medicine and food for the Tigraya people. And say, let us be responsible for this area while the talks are going, and cessation of hostility and silence the guns, in which case Tigray government will be responsible for whatever is left of the, beginning from the day of secession. That may give the Ethiopian government something to show to its fanatics, hey, we have won some, and that may really roll the negotiation and the talks as opposed to both sides going there and walking away from. That is in the back of my mind, saying maybe the reason why they abruptly, reinforced themselves to capture Shire and what have you is that. But they, on the flip side, that same formula creates the challenge of Eritrea being part of the equation. What does this? Eritrea lost thousands and thousands of its soldiers and a lot of, resources between now and the last. What is in it for her, knowing that, as Patrick was saying, Isaiah is not an easy man to deal with, a very enigmatic person who's not talking to anybody. When the negotiation starts to bear some fruits, I've been thinking the negative side of it, which is Isaiah coming out of the woods and saying, what is in it for me? And I could see and dream and imagine him and Abiy talking, and him calling Abiy and saying, what the hell do you think you are doing? Where are my boys? Why did my boys die? So both the opportunities and the challenges are there. One factor is missing, and that's the Western pressure. If the Western pressure is as easy as it has been, Abiy and Isaias will play that game, and at the end of the day, Abiy will listen to Isaias. But if the West comes, very, very serious condition on Abiy's power in Aret Kilo, on other measures, including completely suspending some of the benefits that's getting from the West, then he will be positioned to either choose Isaias or peace process. I don't think we have that position of the West yet.
On the same token,
let me just add one thing. Look, in terms of how Abiy is rallying, I got the news from Jijiga, where Mustafa Akshari's leader is called every employee of the government, thousands of them, and said you have to show up at the demonstration, you, your family, your kids, because they don't trust the average Somali who's there, who are completely in a position to, not so much the war or this and that, but the entire PP rule. And they have been conditioned on the fact that if they don't show up, they will lose their employment with the government. And that's the only employment that exists in the entire Somali region. So you can tell Abiy is not preparing for a peaceful transition here.
I think that goes with Teachers Association being told there is a transport ready for you to take you to the where the rally will happen, but if you are not coming, then that's at your own risk. So all these are being made in public. One thing, Duke, I want to comment you to comment on is what happened this week. So the State Department mentioned about how Russia and Ethiopia acquired drones from Iran. And of course, on Russia, there is a strong statement in terms of sanctions, all that, on Iran as well. But there is no mention of any sanction in relation to that when it comes to Ethiopia. Then today at the UN Security Council, among other things, they unanimously adopted that, targeting what happened in Haiti in terms of arms embargo, travel ban, sanctions, and so on. But again, nothing on Tigray. So is this telling us something, in terms of where the State Department, the government is when it comes to Ethiopia? Duke.
Yeah, I think it is. I think one thing it's telling us is that the U.S. and the UN have just been beaten when it comes to the diplomatic approach to this. If they had good intentions, which I know that there are people who question whether or not they did, I happen to believe that they do hope to end the violence there. They're just going about it very stupidly, to be frank about it. But yeah, I mean, this is when Gutierrez did a press conference, I believe it was earlier this week, to talk about Ethiopia. He gave his usual very bland talk about Ethiopia, and then announced that we're going into Haiti to break the blockade. And they said, why? So they're not allowing fuel in. And that seems to be what, and then we're seeing with the drones, it's like, yeah, we're going to punish Russia. But we're not, Ethiopia is sort of off the table. There's been, the State Department has, I believe, fallen in love with this concept of quiet diplomacy, excuse me, of quiet diplomacy, where they don't say anything. There's no confrontation, only minor confrontations, minor, condemnations of certain acts. or something, but there's no accountability. There's absolute impunity, and it keeps them in the mix. It keeps them, in the negotiations, and it keeps these peace talks happening. We realize it's been almost a year since they decided to shelve the genocide determination to allow peace talks a chance to work and everything. But this has shown how badly that is failing, and that is, it is killing people right now. I mean, they don't have any more time. The IDPs, particularly the people who just had absolutely nothing, who were just living off of aid, which is a lot of the people in places like Shira, when they are not able to get aid anymore, you have a matter of days, weeks, maybe to get aid there. And these are the things that need to be negotiated. Now, peace definitely needs to be negotiated. National dialogue is a great idea eventually, if it can be done in a legitimate way. But the fact that they're not talking about how to make sure that the civilians survive, civilian security, when the offensive sort of intensified, I watched the news for the first time in a while on television, and they were saying Putin's declaring martial law in Ukraine. This is terrible for Ukraine. I feel a lot of compassion and sympathy for the civilians who are affected there. Why is there no coverage of what's happening to civilians in Ethiopia? From the media, we get some, but not much. From the government, we get some concern, but no action. It just shows the real difference between what's happening elsewhere in the world and what's happening in Ethiopia, as far as how it's being seen at the Department of State, how it's being seen at the UN Security Council, and everything. So it's very disappointing.
Thank you, Luke. Patrick, I want to bring Canada here. We have been talking about US and the UN. Today, there was a presentation at the Parliamentary Subcommittee on International Human Rights issues. And let's just play a clip from that presentation regarding Tigray. And I want you to use Canada as an example, but in terms of international response.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak today on behalf of United Tigray Canada. It has been almost 2 years since the start of the conflict, and evidence has mounted of atrocity crimes and human rights abuses committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces against Tigrayans. There's evidence of sexual and gender-based violence, forced displacement, mass killings, and cultural destructions, and what Human Rights Watch has described as a campaign of ethnic cleansing targeting Tigrayans. Humanitarian access and aid has been blocked. There's also emerging evidence of genocide, and this is the crime on which I will focus the bulk of my oral submissions. Genocide is defined in the UN Genocide Convention and in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The definition is identical in each instrument. Genocide occurs when any one of 5 underlying acts is committed with an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The 5 underlying acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on...
So this is a presentation of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights at the Canadian Parliament. Patrick, what is your reading? We have talked about this subject when we met last time on this show. What is your reading in terms of how Canada is seeing what's happening in Tigray?
I've obviously been extremely critical from the beginning of the war, because Canada has not only said very little and done very little, but less than the United States. The United States removed Ethiopia's AGOA status. There was some sanctions placed on high-level officials. Canada's done nothing. Its condemnation has been very light. It's issued statements, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had a conversation with Abiy a few months into the war, and he basically said, we're still friends and partners with Ethiopia, and he mentioned the war, but there was no mention of human rights abuses. A lot of people have brought up the fact that Canada has mining interests in Tigray and Ethiopia as an explanation. And I think there's some basis to that, because I think a lot of times the way international actors act is based on their geopolitical strategies. So that includes economic and political calculations. And so Canada has been almost mute. A little bit recently, you've seen some statements of condemnation, but what I noticed was that a lot of the statements were directed more towards Eritrea. And one thing that you'll note is that while Canada was invested, or Canadian mining companies were invested in Eritrea, in the Bisha mine, that there was a case against them for the use of forced conscripts in the Eritrean mine. And so the Canadian interests have been sold off to Chinese companies. Also, Eritrea is just less geopolitically significant. So I think it's a lot easier for the Canadian government to criticize them. So you are seeing a little bit more action, but over the long haul, especially given that Justin Trudeau has put himself forward as the prime minister whose foreign policy is feminist foreign policy, and then to be saying nothing about the sexual and gender-based violence in Tigray and elsewhere in Ethiopia, and all of the atrocities. I mean, it's been thoroughly disappointing, though. I've observed Trudeau enough to know that what he says and what he does are very often very divorced from each other. In terms of the other actors, I think Duke made a lot of interesting points in terms of the United States and comparing it to other cases, because again, I feel like it's always guided by their geopolitical interests. So you've had declarations that China is committing genocide against its Muslim Uyghur population. You've had a number of countries saying that Russia's committing genocide in Ukraine. And I don't want to downplay either of those situations, because there's horrific abuses being committed in both of those cases. But if we're comparing it to what's happened in Ethiopia, I think it's obviously the height of hypocrisy to say that genocide is taking place in those two cases, but we're not going to say that in the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea's actions. And the only thing I can come up with to explain that is it's not geopolitically in their interest, because China and Russia, in terms of the United States and other Western powers, are obviously enemy states. And so they want a genocide declaration because then it gives them license to intervene. Whereas in countries like Ethiopia, they don't want a genocide declaration, because then that obliges them to intervene under the responsibility to protect. And this is the same song and dance that we saw in Rwanda in 1994, where there was this whole debate over acts of genocide versus genocide. Once you declare it a genocide, then you're obliged to intervene in some way. And I think it's just not viewed as being as pressing an issue that they want to devote their resources and get involved in Ethiopia in that type of way. So you have statements issued and some small actions, again, like the AGOA determination, but they're not willing to go further than that.
Thank you, Patrick. Faisal, talking about the US, the State Department specifically, we have been talking before in terms of who is calling, in terms of what should be done and how the State Department acts. So the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, again today, was mentioned in a number of reports that she's the one hindering maybe a meaningful action when it comes to Ethiopia, Eritrea, and so on. So then that we have also heard that the president is well aware of the situation. So where do you see this going in terms of Monday and beyond?
Yeah, well, there are several things happening. One, in terms of the geopolitics and America's strategic interest in Ethiopia, things must be changing. I think Kenya is receiving more attention as the anchor of the West. The Lamu and infrastructural development in Kenya is making the Red Sea of Eritrea less significant. that may be probably creating some agitation within Isaias. He really doesn't know what his future holds. He understands that Ethiopia is talking to him on the war front, but is also talking to Somalia and Kenya on another front. I am privy of the conversation that Abiy is having with Somalia, saying that he will utilize, because the southern production of Ethiopia comes mainly from the southern regions of Ethiopia. So there is a talk that he will shift his attention away from the north and from Assab. And so, and that's why I was saying later on, we have not seen the ugly part of Isaias yet in this war. When he realizes that he stands in the cold, things may happen, and Abiy is playing cards with him as much as Isaias played. In terms of the US, I totally agree with it. I think outside the fact that Ethiopia is a huge country and it may have some market interest for the West, and also some, if it spirals out of control, it may impact the regional areas. Other than that, what the US gives to Ethiopia vis-a-vis the return that comes from Ethiopia, I think there may be even a loss as far as America is concerned, if you really just do the simple accounting. Yes, there is some hope that the Ogaden oil will play a significant role, and China may not succeed to be the one that's exploiting. That's the big interest of the US at this point in time. Nothing more than that. Ethiopia's agriculture has died in the last few years, and I think the Ogaden oil is the glue that's now holding the US to Ethiopia. Other than that, being a big country and a huge population, the anchor that Ethiopia used to have has been lost. The war on terrorism is less significant now because Somalia and Kenya are holding their grounds when it comes to Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab has been reduced to a background noise and a problem to Somalia. It's not a problem to the region from Tanzania all the way to Ethiopia. It's no longer that. So I totally agree with what Patrick said in terms of what Somalis called about Russia. Just give them enough noise so that they can hear, but don't do anything that is earth-shattering. That's America's position at this point in time. And I think they are holding two things at bay. They're holding the genocide designation at bay, because as Patrick said, it will completely change the equation. They're also holding at bay the famine situation, because if America and the West designates Ethiopia as a famine region, they will stop all non-essential help and aid given to Ethiopia, and everything will be dedicated to famine and feed the people. They don't want to do that. So both of those issues reflect US's lukewarm attitude to the entire question that we face in Ethiopia. So I think we don't have to expect a lot more than what we have been seeing. And the US will just do enough and give enough noise to the rest of the world to ensure that that they'll not be accused of watching an African Armageddon. They would do that. In terms of the undersecretary, I just go back to some of the literature that talks about how the US Department has been depleted since the 1990s. Before the 1990s, you had veterans that worked in the US State Department that knew America very well. I think even in the era of Susan Rice, they knew very well as far as the Ethiopian question is. From Blinken all the way down to the undersecretary, including some liaison of the national security, you really question their understanding of the Ethiopian and the Horn of Africa context. You don't have your Brzezinskis, you don't have your Kissingeris that really used to fashion the policy, whether you supported them or not. And I think that is also another issue. It has fallen, the Ethiopian question has fallen in the hands of the charlatans who are advising our president. Just if you recall the last time the US was trying to get involved in the Horn of Africa, people like Susan Rice were going through the entire US higher education institutions, UCLA, Stanford, Harvard, what have you, and literally build sort of like grassroots support, so that when America joined it and went to Somalia and started helping, it had taken care of its homework here in the country. I have yet to see a single lecture of a US policymaker speaking about the Ethiopian issue at a public forum. Blinken was in Stanford 2 weeks ago or a week ago. He was completely talking about some chump change type questions in the world.
Thank you, Faisal. Yeah, as we speak, I guess my camera is still in Addis. And Duke, again, this is about how the State Department works internally, but also what the role of what has been delivered from Mike Hammer's tenure as a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. So some people credit him for the Djibouti talks, and maybe even he might be behind what's happening, what will happen in South Africa and so on. But again, if you remember when he visited with other envoys to Maqala, at that time the question was for resuming and reconnecting Tigray to basic services. He asked the government of Tigray for assurances of safety to the federal government workers. The Tigray government issued a letter and he carried that with him, and he was announcing that at that time. Then we know what happened after that. So any hopes by having Mike Hammer, maybe he might be flying as well to South Africa this weekend. Any hopes in terms of what the US State Department has been saying and what they might be helping in terms of Monday?
As far as Mike Hammer goes, I don't have any hopes right now. It may be that he is working behind the scenes and working very hard, and there'll be some big development that comes about from all of his discussions and everything. But it's been too long. There's been too much time that he spent in Addis getting very little accomplished. When he the first trip they went, I was a little optimistic because there were some minor moves. There was it looked like fuel got released after. I mean, it happened right after he got there. I mean, so maybe that was his doing. Maybe it was something that was already in the works. They got the secret talks in Djibouti happening, but that was sort of a shambles. Nobody took him seriously. It looked like on the Ethiopian side to send people who could actually negotiate. So it doesn't look like he carries a lot of weight anywhere. I mean, he is the third special envoy, the fourth if you count the acting who then quit. I can't say at this time that I have any optimism for him because he hasn't produced anything yet. He's been sitting in Addis watching, up more than 1 million people in Tigray fall back under occupation, perhaps in the Northwest province and God forbid in the central zone as well. So I can't tell what his impact is. He almost gets people to talk. That's great. He tried to position the U.S., in the AU to have the U.S. and the EU and the UN special mediators to be, a bigger factor in those negotiations. I don't think that happened. So he's shown me nothing really. I don't have any real optimism that he's going to play a useful role. I would love to be wrong. I would love to come in here next week and talk about how stupid I was for saying this, but I don't think that he's playing a particularly constructive role. I think that he's sort of a placeholder, and really he's acting like the third string special envoy that he appears to be, and nothing personal against the guy. He was on a event. He seemed like a genuinely good person, but I'm not sure that he was picked to be a real mover in this. I'm not sure I mean, to be the third person, I think that his main qualification is that he probably promised that he would not quit after learning what the details of his assignment would be. So I don't have a lot of hope for Mike Hammer, but maybe I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong.
We'll go to the final talk section. And as we speak today, just a few hours ago, the state television in Tigray reported that Adwa, the historic city of Adwa, was under aerial attack and civilians killed there. So this is a 1 hour drive to the east of Shire, which now is under control of the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. Faisal, you mentioned about Adwa, the two versions of Adwa. Can you speak to that and give us as well your final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I tweeted by saying that Adwa gave Ethiopia the unique designation of being the only African country that kept its independence. So Adwa was, the front for that, and Ethiopia got a lot of political mileage from that, from Africans, whether it's myth or not. It has gotten that. Today, also, Adwa is the gateway to the invasion and Eritrean foreign invasion of Tigray to subjugate. That's the very region that probably produced the largest number of soldiers to defend Adwa and get the victory of Adwa. So I was basically just reflecting. You have here two wars, both of them, symbolized by Adwa. One becomes a gateway for invasion of the Tigray people. The other one was a victory that gave Ethiopia the enviable position in the world, and for that matter, in Black history. Abiy's legacy would be remembered within the second gateway, within the second aspect of Adwa. No matter what he says, I think Abiy has produced a new Ethiopia. He has undermined, in my opinion, and I'm not a supporter of that. I think he has undermined the Abyssinian concept of Ethiopianness. He has completely severed the relationship between Amharas and Tigray, who have been allies for centuries. Give and take. What happened this time will never be forgotten by Tigrayans, and it would be years and years to heal. Whether that will produce a new state within the Ethiopian very politic and geography, I cannot say. What I am suspecting now, the more I see the intensity of the war, the more I suspect that Isaias may not even give up some of the regions that he is now conquering. I could be again wrong, but I want to be naive here to say that, naive enough to say that Isaias may have ulterior motives to somehow claim some of the land that he's conquering. After all, he fought in the past on that land, and he is fighting on that land, and he's the main culprit to really partake in this war. So from historical point of view, from Ethiopian politics, whether this negotiation and the AU-led talks culminate in a peaceful transition and pathway, I think that is to be seen. What will be taken as a final outcome from this war, beyond the day-to-day battles that we see, is that Ethiopia has changed for good. And that's why Abiy is talking behind the scene, some concept that he's erroneously promoting, which is the Cushitic concept. He's talking to Somalis, he's talking to people from Somalia, he's talking to some groups within the Ethiopian body politic, saying that this is the prime minister of Ethiopia, that the old Ethiopia will not be together, some change will be in the offing. And I think maybe he knows what's coming out of this, but he is not having a tight grip on the Ethiopia that he presides over. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Patrick, your final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think Faisal makes a lot of great points, especially particularly related to Eritrea's role, which I think is central to ending the conflict, but in terms of Eritrea playing effectively a spoiler role to any peace talks, that we don't know exactly where Abiy himself stands. I think during the 5 months of the sort of informal truce, I was getting the sense that maybe Abiy and the Ethiopian government was war weary and that they'd been worn down and they were ready to just sell for peace. But I think what you saw at that time was that their moves towards peace included a crackdown in Amhara, which then eroded his support in the Amhara region. And also you saw alliances between Isaias and Amhara elites intensifying during that period. And you also saw rifts emerging between Abiy and Isaias. So Abiy is put in this very difficult position. If we're viewing things from his perspective, we're saying, even if he wants peace, which I'm not convinced is the case, but even if he does, if we grant him that, we say that then he's going to make an enemy out of the Amhara region and Isaias. So obviously the thing that's driving elite discourse in the Amhara region is the issue of Western Tigray of Welkai. So he knows that for them, this is the central element of the war. If he gives any concessions on that front, then he's going to have a war to fight or a battle to fight with Amhara. He knows that if he doesn't pursue the plan, and Isaias's plan, of course, was not only to destroy the TPLF and the TDF completely, but to degrade and destroy Tigrayan society in every means that he can, because he sees them as a security threat, that if he doesn't go ahead with that plan, then he has Isaias to deal with. And what would that look like in a world in which Abiy is now an adversary of Isaias? Would that ever devolve into a military struggle? So he's caught in between he doesn't have a strong support anywhere. In Oromia, I think since 2018, his support has completely eroded. And in many other regions, obviously it's non-existent in Tigray, it's waning in Amhara region. So he's really caught and he's trying to play up the international community to get them on his side, to have the funds because the economy's cratering. So he's really caught in between trying to play all of these rival forces where if he pleases one, it then alienates another. And so he's trying to play this dual game where he's trying to please them all. But at the end of the day, I feel like he's pleasing no one. But I do think Eritrea's role in it is the central force. But because Eritrea is such a rogue state that's not going to be a part of peace talks, and if it was, wouldn't play a productive role, it's very difficult to know how to deal with them in a way that doesn't, in the end, result in a new form of conflict with Eritrea.
I think there is a need to mention that an agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea from August this year, in a document that is leaked, there is a mention of how Eritrea feels that what America did as a mistake in Vietnam was not targeting the people and depriving the enemy the social base. So they said 2 years ago they made that mistake in Tigray. So the whole target of this campaign, the recent campaign, is depriving TDF their social base. So that is, I think, maybe something that the international community, I hope, knows about and act on. Duke, you have started a show. Actually, there was a comment where your first show was great and they are asking for more of these shows. And being interested in the humanitarian affairs, that's your show as well. What is your final thought and how what we saw in Shire, actually a person was reporting that the IDPs in Adiabo were targeted and they moved to Shire, and they were targeted, they moved to Aksum, and they are being targeted there as well. So what would be unfolding in the coming days and weeks, the way you see it?
Well, what has been keeping me glued to my computer screen for the past week has been the potential catastrophe that we're looking at from a humanitarian standpoint, with the Ethiopian government once again talking about how to facilitate humanitarian aid in areas under their control. This could give them the tools to finish the genocide that they started. They need international monitoring in distributing humanitarian aid. They need for the US, for the United Nations, for all the donor countries to take a tough line with stopping them from interrupting humanitarian access. Totally. This is what it looked like in the beginning of the war. This was the IPC food assessment from just prior to when they took occupation of Tigray. You can see that phase 5 is famine. Phase 1 is low food insecurity. You can see that most people were in phase 1 or 2. They did a projection at that time which showed that probably most people would still be at phase 1 or 2, around 70%, 80% maybe would be in the safe areas. There would be a small uptick in phase 4, but it would be manageable through humanitarian assessment. Now, if you look at the next slide here, at the next chart, it shows this is what they got after 7 months of occupation. This is a catastrophe. They took what appeared to be a healthy region and turned it into a wasteland of famine and destruction in every sort of human rights atrocity that you can think of has been documented there. This is what they did with a healthy country. They turned it into 70%, 7 out of 10 people were starving. Now they have an unhealthy, a region that has been devastated by famine. This is what they're taking over now. If you look at the next chart here, what it shows is that the places that were hardest hit by the famine, the epicenter of the famine that was created by the occupation is in the Northwest and the Central Zone. This is where all but about 25,000 of the people that they said were in famine conditions at that time, at the time of the December assessment, were in, at the time of the June assessment, were in famine conditions. And it has not gotten better since then due to the blockade. Now, if they don't allow humanitarian access now, these people have, some of the people who are in, there's 100,000 people in a field about 40 miles away from Shire right now. I don't know if they're still there. They have been sent 100,000 rations of food, not enough to feed everybody. They don't have enough food. They don't have any medicine. Some of the people in that field have as long as it takes for a human being to starve to death before they die. And that's something that we need to get very serious about right now and solve. That's my final thought. Sorry.
Thank you, Duke. The UN and the US authorities, everyone from European Union, we remember how they reacted for the fuel that was allegedly taken by Tigray authorities. And we are hearing from Shire when Tigray forces left, they left aid, I think supplies in Shire, and that is looted by Eritrean forces and being shipped to Asmara. So we are not seeing that reaction, but this is something that I think you will also follow up in your show, perhaps in the coming days or next week. So with that, we finished today's show. There was a comment on there was an echo when I played the Canadian Parliamentary Subcommittee on International Human Rights. So we'll be finishing today's show by playing that. But I would like to thank Faisal Robler, Duke Burbridge, and Patrick White for your insightful contribution today as usual, and hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak today on behalf of United Tagaru Canada. It has been almost 2 years since the start of the conflict, and evidence has mounted of atrocity crimes and human rights abuses committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces against Tigrayans. There's evidence of sexual and gender-based violence, forced displacement, mass killings, and cultural destructions in what Human Rights Watch has described as a campaign of ethnic cleansing targeting Tigrayans. Humanitarian access and aid has been blocked. There's also emerging evidence of genocide, and this is the crime on which I will focus the bulk of my oral submissions. Genocide is defined in the UN Genocide Convention and in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The definition is identical in each instrument. Genocide occurs when any one of 5 underlying acts is committed with an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The 5 underlying acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In Tigray, there is growing evidence of genocide. At the least, there is evidence of a serious risk of genocide, which is enough to obligate Canada to act to prevent it, pursuant to Canada's own international legal obligations as a state party to the Genocide Convention. First, and this relates to the first of the 5 underlying acts, there is substantial evidence that Tigrayans are being killed. Mass killings of Tigrayan civilians has permeated this conflict since November 2020, when hundreds of Tigrayans were massacred in Aksum. There were also killings in Humera and Mekelle. The UN International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, in its report last month, documented that Ethiopian and allied forces are increasingly engaged in airstrikes, indiscriminately killing and injuring Tigrayan civilians. There is also substantial evidence that serious bodily and mental harm are being committed against Tigrayans, and that conditions of life, including famine and the denial of humanitarian access, are being inflicted. These relate to the second and third underlying acts in the Genocide Convention, respectively. The UN International Commission concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Ethiopian and allied forces, quote, implemented a widespread range of measures designed to systematically deprive the population of Tigray of material and services indispensable for its survival, end quote. In other words, famine is being used as a weapon of war. The requisite intent to destroy a group is often the hardest to prove, but in Tigray, there is mounting evidence of intent to destroy Tigrayans as a group. Reporting by Human Rights Watch found sexual violence to be a defining feature of the conflict, and evidence of genocidal intent is evident from the testimony. For example, one 30-year-old survivor shared that as she was raped by 4 men, they said to her, quote, "You and your race are a foul, toilet-smelling race and should not be on our land," end quote. The UN International Commission found that Tigrayan women and girls are targeted with particular violence and brutality, and that attackers use dehumanizing language suggestive of an intent to destroy the Tigrayan ethnicity. One Tigrayan woman was told after she was gang raped that, quote, "Our problem is with your womb, and a Tigrayan womb should never give birth." Genocidal intent is also indicated by the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, and by repopulation of Tigrayan areas in keeping with a governmental policy to change the ethnic character of the region. We have heard earlier this morning about dehumanizing hate speech. All this is indicative of an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Tigrayan people. This evidence of an intent to destroy, when paired with at least one of the 5 underlying acts, is indicative of genocide. At the least, the evidence documented so far in this conflict denotes a serious risk of genocide, which is enough under the law that Canada is obliged to act. The next question becomes how Canada should act. Our fulsome recommendations to that effect are included in UTC's most recent brief, which is dated October 2022, which I am told you will receive next week. Among other things, Canada should impose targeted sanctions on Ethiopian and Eritrean officials responsible, engage in criminal prosecutions using our universal jurisdiction laws, and resettle Tigrayan refugees, including the 65,000 plus that are presently in Sudan. I will leave it there for now, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.